Hey Exile, PoE Academy here with a skill I wanted to play for a very long time. Sweep. You think it's not the best skill at the moment? Well, you're right, but paired with Voidforge and Berserker we can put out some serious DPS. I've spent roughly 50 divines for the current state of the build, which grants about 18 million DPS fully buffed. The build is not a full glass cannon, but be aware that you are not rare class tanky as Exile. As always, you can find the POB and the shopping list in the description. Stick to the end to get my conclusion on the build, where it performs well and where it doesn't. Let's go. The build itself is not very complex, and the basic idea is to use Voidforge to convert all physical damage to elemental damage, and then scale physical and elemental damage as well as attack speed. You also want to scale a little bit of area of effect to make the clear speed decent. The only mandatory item for this build is obviously Voidforge. I'd also consider Abysses and the Interrogation Jewel as core items, since they boost your damage drastically. Other than that, you only need some accuracy rating on your gear, for example on your gloves, to hit the hit cap, and that's it. The next upgrade to consider would be a Warlord and Hunter chest with additional curse. Attacks have more base crit and minus 15 mana cost to socketed attacks. This will be 1/3 of your final damage and costs around 5 divines at current prices if you buy the chest instead of crafting it. On other rares you mostly want life and resistances. You want to try to get chaos resistance wherever you can, and make sure to get high resistance rolls because the build is a little bit scuffed on resistances. If your budget is a bit tighter and you don't get as many resistances on your rare gear, you can also skip the Circle of Guild ring for now and replace it with a rare ring with a lot of resistances. Your rare amulet is a nice source of cheap damage when you get one with Flat Fizz, crit and crit multi. A nice quality of life feature of the build is when you get your Abysses with an endurance charge on hit enchant for Sweep. You might have noticed that the build is elemental immune, and the reason for this is the Storm Shroud jewel, which converts chance to avoid being shocked to apply to all elemental ailments. This includes freeze, chill, ignite, shocked, and also brittle, sapped and scorched. I felt that the build was much more tanky after including the setup, so you should also consider doing so. The way you achieve 100% elemental immunity is by rolling your boots implicits with chance to avoid elemental ailments and chance to avoid being shocked, and then also use an Abyss jewel with chance to avoid being shocked in your belt. On a side note, this setup also allows you to use Vessel of Vinctar because the flask now doesn't shock you anymore. The build also gains a lot from cluster jewels because they are notables, add a lot of damage, and they grant many jewel slots the build craves for. Feed the Fury and Surefoot Striker are your best notables, so try to get them on the side where you socket the cluster jewel into the tree. You could skip the Imbalanced Guard Impossible Escape jewel, and that will also cut down the price of the build by almost 50%, but you also lose quite a bit of elemental all resistances and some damage, so I strongly advise against it. A decent Lethal Pride will add a lot of damage, and you can find cheap seeds by following the trade link in the shopping list. For your endgame setup you also want to wear the Forbidden Jewels, which grant Rite of Ruin. However, this is not mandatory, and if you're a budget you could also just use regular gems with decent mods. Okay, so let's talk about the skills. You are able to use 2 sixlings in this build, 1 damage setup and 1 aura setup with Enlighten. For your damage setup you want to use a 20 quality sweep for more AoE, and if you feel that your damage is already sufficient, you can swap elemental damage for Pulverize for even more coverage. Your aura setup uses a mix of offensive and defensive auras. Try to get Divergent Arctic Armor for more fist reduction, and Anomalous Precision helps getting your hit chance to 100% more easily because you can level it higher, but alternatively your gloves have to have more accuracy rating. Aim to not reserve more than 40 mana. I'm at 33 unreserved mana, and it makes the playstyle a little bit jerky sometimes. You also want to be using Blood Rage to generate frenzy charges while mapping. Enduring Cry can go on left click if you are lazy like me, or you can use it as another health potion on another button. Now you've come to the real interesting part. The build feels great, but it really needs some time to ramp up, especially on boss fights where you can't attack before the boss spawns, or when you died and go back in, you will need a lot of time to ramp up your rage, various charges and ailments such as Scorched and Brittle, and this will result in much less damage in such scenarios. If you compare fully ramped versus starting to ramp, you can see that the DPS number goes down from 18 million to 4 million. Still decent, but also less than a quarter of what the build is capable of. You won't really notice this in maps, but again, it doesn't feel very good for bossing, as you can see in my attempt to kill the feud. I had no issues though in the Sanctum, because apparently the life total is just lower than in the real endgame content. Defensive wise, the build is okay. It is not the tankiest build, but leap slamming into packs kills many mobs already and stuns the survivors for a short duration, giving you enough time to swipe them away. However, especially Eater of World tentacle mobs can be dangerous if you don't position yourself correctly. All in all, I think this was a fun project, and the top end damage almost feels ridiculous, but the ramp up time is a big bummer. Let me know what you think in the comments. Happy hunting, Exile, and see you in the next one.